Welcome to Teaching Truth. In my pocket guide to dining out in Gran Canaria, it tells me that tapas, fish and fruit are some of the delicacies to be enjoyed. I'm going to look forward to doing that when I eat some of the food when we fly out to Gran Canaria later this summer. Within the pocket guide to the early church, food was mentioned as an important ingredient. It was an essential part of their doing life together. In Acts chapter 2, 42 to 47, we read these words: "They devoted themselves to the breaking of bread." Now, the breaking of bread was not simply about sharing communion and sharing bread together and remembering Jesus' body that was given. Nor was it simply about taking wine together and remembering Jesus' blood that had been shed on the cross. Sharing communion was important, and sharing bread and wine and remembering Jesus' death was an integral part of sharing meals together. But it wasn't just about the Lord's Supper. Sharing a meal together was important in the culture. The early church invested a lot in eating together. Eating together was important, and food was an important part of doing life together in the early church. The tradition of people eating together being a sign of God's reign or kingdom goes way, way back into Judeo-Christian history. It's a picture that's painted eloquently by the prophets and celebrated also in the Psalms. Isaiah 25 verse 6, "On this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-matured wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-matured wines strained clear." The picture painted by the prophet is also a picture painted by the psalmist in Psalm 23. "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows." And Jesus himself was rooted in and lived out in a practical sense this tradition of eating together. You only need to journey with Jesus through his 3 years of ministry to see the number of times that Jesus met with people over a meal and how he met with people at a table. And just as Jesus shared food with all sorts of people and conditions of people as a sign of the inclusivity of God's kingdom, so did the early church. The early church placed much emphasis on sharing a meal together. These gatherings, these meeting for dinner, were earthly representations, in effect, of the heavenly banquet imagery which Jesus had reinforced through his teaching. And following in the footsteps of Jesus, the table fellowship, the importance of having people round for dinner, as it were, was an important element. It was warm and it was accepting. The early church refused to discriminate against the marginalized. Everyone was welcome to the table to partake of this meal. The joy of eating together, the value of table fellowship, as it were, for deepening relationships, the missional fruitfulness of shared meals and the opportunities for sharing faith, biblical study, prayer and worship around the meal table have all been discovered over many, many years and throughout many centuries by both new and ancient forms of being church together. And what strikes me most when I read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and particularly also the Acts of the Apostles, is the importance that was placed on sharing a meal. The act of breaking bread as a way of letting people know that they were welcomed, that they were loved, and that they were respected. The table to which the early church welcomed people was not for the chosen few. It was not a holy huddle. It was a diverse and open table. And just like the early church did, we have the opportunity to open our homes where we can, to welcome friends and neighbours to our table, to our breakfast table, to our lunch table, to our dinner table, to our supper table, to reflect Jesus, to reflect something of the reality and the depth of fellowship that was expressed in the early church. By expanding that kind of hospitality that embraces everyone equally. Now let me ask you, as I ask myself the question, as we reflect on what the early church did and the challenge to us, as we seek to be followers, as we seek to be disciples of Jesus. Just as Jesus invited people around his table, just as the early church invited people around their table, who can we invite to our table, to our breakfast table, to our lunch table, to our dinner table, to our supper table? Perhaps we need to build a bigger table.